Eun's faceted eyes glimmered in the dim light. Your adaptability. Your emotional responses. The way your mind works. She hesitated, then added, most species follow logical patterns we can predict. Humans surprise us. Taiho thought about this. After days of being prodded, scanned, and tested, it was strange to hear something positive about humanity. Is that why I'm in this cage? Because we're surprising. Eun's skin rippled with colors. A blush, perhaps, or some alien equivalent of discomfort. We don't see it as a cage. It's standard containment protocol. She touched the clear barrier between them. My people have been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years. We observe, we learn, we catalog. Like a zoo, Taiho said flatly. Eun's head tilted. No, like a library. Each species adds knowledge to our understanding of life itself. Taiho stood up and approached the barrier, standing face to face with Eun. She didn't back away. Libraries don't keep their books against their will, he said. A sound like gentle bells came from Eun. A laugh, he realized. You always use these metaphors. This is one of the traits we find fascinating. Her expression turned serious. But you should know, Jill doesn't share my interest in your cognitive abilities. She wants tissue samples, genetic material. Taiho felt cold. That sounds invasive. It would be. That's why I brought you this. She gestured to the translator disc. If you can communicate with us, show your intelligence clearly, perhaps Neri will classify you differently. As what? Something more than a specimen. As a sentient observer, it's rare, but it has happened before. This gave Taiho hope. He wasn't the first to be in this situation, and others had found a way out. Help me then, he said. Teach me about your people, your language. I'll show them I'm worth talking to, not just studying. Eun seemed to consider this. It's risky. Neri follows protocol strictly, and Jia doesn't like me much, Taiho finished. She doesn't dislike you. She just doesn't see you as. Eun struggled for the word. A person, Taiho supplied. Eun nodded slowly. Yes. A soft chime sounded from somewhere in the lab. Eun glanced nervously toward the door. I must go. The next shift begins soon. She pointed to the disc. Keep this hidden. I'll return tomorrow night. As she turned to leave, Taiho called after her. Wait. What are you called? Your people, I mean. Eun paused. In your tongue, the closest would be Elunari. And where am I? What planet? This is a research vessel, not a planet. We orbit the edges of your solar system. She made a gesture with her slender fingers. Far enough to avoid detection, close enough to observe. With that, she slipped away, leaving Taiho with more questions than answers. The next day, the tests continued, but now Taiho understood much more of what was happening. The translator disc, hidden under his pillow when not in use, allowed him to comprehend the Elunari language. He heard Jia discussing enzyme extraction procedures. He understood when Neri noted his sleep patterns and brain activity, and he began to respond in ways that confused them. When shown a series of pattern recognition tests, Taiho deliberately solved them using different approaches each time. When asked to communicate basic needs, he used increasingly complex sentences. Jia noticed first. Specimen X is demonstrating accelerated learning curves. Possible contamination in the test design. Neri observed more carefully. No, I believe it's genuine adaptation. Fascinating. During a break between tests, Taiho sat quietly, watching Eun work at her station. Without looking up, she subtly tapped her ear and then pointed to a display showing Earth languages. Taking the hint, Taiho spoke up. I can understand you better today. All three scientists turned to stare at him. It speaks our language now. Jia asked, surprised. Not fully, Taiho said carefully. But I learn. I listen. Neri approached his enclosure, silver hair floating gently around her face. How did you acquire this understanding, Specimen X? Taiho thought quickly. Your tests, the language patterns. I notice things. Yun spoke up. Humans are known for pattern recognition abilities. Perhaps the neural mapping sessions triggered accelerated language acquisition. Jia looked skeptical, but Neri seemed intrigued. This suggests cognitive flexibility beyond our initial assessment. She turned to Yun. Prepare the communication array for tomorrow. Let's test the extent of this development. That night, Yun returned as promised. She brought something that looked like a small book. What's that? Tahoe asked after placing the translator disc behind his ear. Visual reference guide to our homeworld and culture, she explained. I told Neri I wanted to study your reaction to our architecture. She placed the book-like object against the barrier. It adhered there, and the cover began to glow, showing moving images of a world unlike anything Tahoe had seen. Cities built into massive trees, buildings that seemed to float on light, oceans with multiple moons reflected on their surfaces. It's beautiful, Tahoe whispered. This is Ilunar, our homeworld. Yun said with obvious pride. We evolved in symbiosis with the crystal forests. Our technology grew from understanding molecular harmonics rather than mechanical engineering. As she explained, Tahoe asked questions, thoughtful ones about their history, their social structure, their beliefs. Yun answered eagerly, clearly pleased to be sharing her culture rather than just collecting data. Your people have achieved so much, Tahoe said finally. Why do you still need to study other species like this? Yun's expression dimmed slightly. Because we've reached our limits in some ways. Our population is declining. We reproduce rarely now. Some believe studying other life forms will help us find new paths forward. And what do you believe? Tahoe asked. Yun was quiet for a moment. I believe in connection, in learning through exchange, not just observation. She looked at him intently. Tomorrow, during the communication test, show them everything you can do. Speak as well as you're speaking to me now. Won't they know you helped me? Perhaps, but results matter more than methods to Neri. Yun's skin rippled with colors again, and I've decided it's worth the risk. The next morning, Tahoe awoke to find the lab unusually busy. New equipment had been brought in, and Neri was directing its setup with precise instructions. When they finally came for him, Tahoe was led not to the usual examination table, but to a circular area with comfortable seating and various instruments arranged around it. Today we assess your communication capabilities, Specimen X, Neri announced. Tahoe took a deep breath and spoke clearly in their language. I would prefer if you called me by my name. I am Tahoe. The shock on Neri's face was worth the risk. Jia stepped forward, eyes narrowed suspiciously. This is impossible, she said. The language acquisition timeline is clearly different for humans. Tahoe interrupted, careful to use proper grammatical structures as Yun had taught him. We adapt quickly when motivated. Neri recovered her composure. Indeed, most interesting. She gestured to the seating. Please, sit, Tahoe. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. As the testing proceeded, Tahoe demonstrated not just language comprehension but cultural understanding, asking thoughtful questions about Illuminary history that he knew from Yun's lessons. By the end of the session, even Jia seemed grudgingly impressed. The specimen shows remarkable cognitive flexibility, she admitted to Neri. Not specimen, Tahoe corrected gently. Person, just like you. Neri studied him with those crystal eyes. Perhaps it is time to reconsider your classification, Tahoe of Earth. Perhaps indeed. Later, when Yun came to his enclosure, her skin was glowing with excitement. You did wonderfully. Neri has approved advanced interaction protocols. Starting tomorrow, you'll be allowed supervised access to the Learning Center. Tahoe smiled, feeling hope for the first time since his abduction. Will you be my supervisor? Yun's skin flushed a deeper blue. Yes, we have much to learn from each other. As she turned to go, Tahoe called after her. Yun, thank you for seeing me as more than just Specimen X. She looked back, her faceted eyes reflecting the dim light. Perhaps someday my people will see yours as equals, not subjects. Until then, she pressed her hand against the barrier, and Taeho raised his to meet it, separated only by the transparent wall between their worlds. Until then, Taeho agreed, we keep talking. Our world faces biological limitations, Yeon explained as she showed Taeho holographic images of her civilization. Gleaming cities floated among clouds, but the population numbers were declining. We study species like yours for solutions. Your adaptability, your immune system, they're remarkable. Taeho learned that humans weren't the only specimens. Down the corridor were containment units holding beings from a dozen worlds. The High Council sends inspectors tomorrow, Yeon warned. Nari will have to justify keeping you in the observation program instead of transferring you to biological sampling. That sounds unpleasant, Taeho said. It is. Few specimens returned from there intact. Later, as he lay awake, Taeho noticed Jia watching him with calculated interest. Unlike Yeon's curious gaze, Jia's held something colder, something that made him uneasy. The learning center had become Taeho's favorite place on the research vessel. Unlike his small containment unit, the center offered views of space through wide crystal panels. Today, he could see Earth in the distance, a small blue dot that made his heart ache with longing. You miss your home, Yeon said, not as a question, but as a fact she had observed. Every day, Taeho admitted, turning away from the view. But I'm grateful for these privileges. At least I'm not strapped to a table anymore. Yeon's skin rippled with colors. Embarrassment, he had learned to recognize. About that, she said, activating a holographic display between them. There's more you should know about why you're here. The display showed the Elunari homeworld in greater detail than before. Beautiful spiral towers made of living crystal stretched toward pink-tinged skies. But as zoomed in, Taeho noticed something strange. The cities seemed empty. Few Elunari walked the shimmering streets. Our civilization is ancient, Yeon explained. We mastered space travel 10,000 years ago. We cured disease. We extended our lifespans to centuries. Her faceted eyes dimmed slightly. But we didn't anticipate the cost. What cost? Taeho asked. Our reproductive rates declined with each technological advance. It's now been 3 generations since a new Elunari was born. She waved her hand, and the display showed population charts, a steady downward line. We're dying as a species. Taeho felt a chill. And that's why you study other species. Looking for answers. Yeon nodded. Humans interest us particularly. You reproduce easily. Your immune systems fight off disease in creative ways. Your cells repair damage efficiently. So I'm here because you want to study human reproduction. Taeho felt his face grow warm. Yeon's skin flashed bright blue, her version of blushing. Not just that aspect. All your biological systems, the way your DNA adapts to environmental pressures. She hesitated. But yes, reproductive biology is part of the research. Taeho walked away from the display, processing this information. So all those tests were to understand your physiology, yes. Yeon approached him cautiously. But I wanted you to know the full truth before the High Council inspector arrives. Why? What difference does it make? Because tomorrow, Nari must present her findings and justify continuing your current treatment protocol. Yeon's voice lowered. Jia has submitted a competing proposal to transfer you to biological sampling. The way she said those words made Taeho's stomach clench. What exactly does that mean? Yeon looked uncomfortable. Invasive procedures, tissue extraction, genetic manipulation trials. They want to dissect me. Taeho felt panic rising. Not exactly, but the procedures are extensive. Yeon touched his arm gently. The first time she had initiated physical contact. That's why we need to prepare. The inspector must see your value as a conscious participant in research, not just as biological material. Later that day, Un took Taiho on his first tour beyond the learning center and his containment area. The research vessel was larger than he had imagined, with curved corridors that connected various laboratories and observation decks. As they passed one corridor, Taiho noticed a series of containment units similar to his own. Inside each was a different being, some vaguely humanoid, others utterly alien in form. "These are the other specimens?" he asked quietly. Ian nodded. From 12 different worlds, all with unique biological traits of interest. Taiho stopped at one unit holding a creature with iridescent fur and 6 limbs. It paced restlessly, occasionally pressing its face to the barrier. "Can they communicate? Do they understand what's happening to them?" "Some do," Ian admitted. "Others have cognitive structures too different from ours for meaningful communication. Have any of them been sent to biological sampling?" Lun's silence was answer enough. "This isn't right," Taiho said firmly. "No matter how advanced your civilization is, this is wrong." "By whose standards?" a cold voice asked from behind them. They turned to find Jia standing there, her lavender skin almost white in the corridor lighting. "Ian, you were instructed to limit the humans' exposure to other research subjects," she said sharply. "The High Council inspector will want to see his reactions to various stimuli," Yun replied, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "I'm gathering observational data." Jia's crystal eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Or are you developing inappropriate empathic connections with research material again?" Taiho stepped forward. "I'm standing right here. I can hear you talking about me like I'm a lab rat." "Your perception of your status is irrelevant," Jia said dismissively. "What matters is your biological value to our research." "Jia," Yun mourned, "the inspector will consider psychological evaluation important too." "The inspector," Jia replied with a cold smile, "will consider efficiency above all. And speaking of efficiency, I need tissue samples from the human before tomorrow's presentation." Taiho tensed. "What kind of samples?" "Nothing you'll miss," Jia said, producing a small device from her pocket. "Hair, skin cells, perhaps a blood draw." Before Yun could object, Jia approached Taiho with the device. He stepped back instinctively. "This won't hurt," Jia said, sounding irritated at his resistance. "And your cooperation will be noted." Taiho looked at Ian, who gave a small nod. "Fine," he said, holding out his arm. "But I want something in return." Jia paused. "Specimens don't negotiate." "This one does," Taiho said firmly. "I want to know what happens after your research is done. Do I go home? Do any of us go home?" Jia pressed the device against his arm. It made a soft humming sound, and Taiho felt a brief tingling sensation as it collected samples. "That," Jia said without looking at him, "depends on the results." After she left, Yun led Taiho back toward his containment unit. He noticed she was unusually quiet. "She's going to recommend the biological sampling, isn't she?" he asked. Ian nodded. "Jia believes it's the most direct path to useful data." "And Nari? What does she think?" "Nari follows protocol. She'll present both approaches and let the inspector decide." Yun stopped walking, checking that they were alone in the corridor. "But there's something else you should know. The High Council doesn't just make decisions about research methods." "What else do they decide?" "They determine which species are considered sentient enough for official contact." Yun's eyes brightened slightly. "If you can convince the inspector that humans are worthy of diplomatic recognition rather than just study." Taiho understood. "Then I might not just save myself, but prevent others from ending up here too." "Exactly." That night, as Taiho lay on his bed in the containment unit, he couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts raced through his mind. About Earth, about the other specimens, about what tomorrow might bring. Movement caught his eye. Through the transparent barrier, he saw Jia standing in the dim light of the corridor, watching him. There was something in her gaze that made him uneasy, not just clinical interest, but something calculating, almost hungry. She raised a hand, pressing it against the control panel beside his unit. Text scrolled across it. Data about him, he assumed. She studied it for a long moment, then looked directly at him, knowing he was awake. "Your biological profile is remarkable," she said, her voice coming through the speaker system. "Your species has such potential. It's almost a shame to limit our investigation to non-invasive methods." Taiho sat up. "Why are you telling me this?" Jia tilted her head. "Because tomorrow, much will change. The inspector will see the logic of my proposal. Humans will become the primary research focus for our genetic revival program. And what happens to me? You'll contribute to saving my species," Jia said simply. "Isn't that a worthy end for any life form?" She turned and walked away, leaving Taiho alone with the cold realization that tomorrow wasn't just about his fate. It was about humanity's first official contact with an advanced alien civilization. And that contact might begin with him on a dissection table. The Inspector Da arrived with an entourage. Tall, imposing with skin like burnished copper, she reviewed Taiho's file with obvious skepticism. "Specimen X has shown no exceptional qualities warranting extended observation," she declared. Spoke up unexpectedly. "I propose a test. Our mineral synthesis program has reached an impasse. Let the human attempt a solution." Neri seemed surprised, but nodded agreement. Given access to their data, Taiho recognized the problem was one of perspective. Where the aliens approached it with methodical logic, he applied creative leaps and intuitive connections. As he worked, he noticed Jia tampering with his console settings. Instead of confronting her, Taiho adapted, using the sabotage to demonstrate human flexibility. When his solution produced a perfect crystalline structure, even Da couldn't hide her astonishment. "Perhaps," she conceded, "there is more to learn from this specimen than I anticipated." The morning of the inspection arrived with a tense atmosphere throughout the research vessel. Taiho was given fresh clothing. A simple tunic and pants made of a soft, silvery material that reminded him of Neri's hair. The clothing felt strange against his skin, too smooth and slightly cool, but it was better than the medical gown he'd been wearing for days. Came to escort him to the presentation chamber. Her blue skin seemed paler than usual, betraying her nervousness. "Remember everything we practiced," she said quietly as they walked. "Be respectful but confident. Show intelligence but not aggression." Taiho nodded. "I know. It's not just about me anymore." The presentation chamber was larger than any room Taiho had seen on the vessel so far. Curved walls rose to a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of space outside. Earth was visible in the distance, a small blue marble that made Taiho's throat tighten with emotion. 6 Illuminari were already present. Neri stood at a central console, her silver hair arranged more formally than usual. Jia was nearby, checking data displays with quick, precise movements. 4 others Taiho didn't recognize sat in a semicircle of floating chairs. Then the main doors opened, and Inspector Da entered. Taiho tried not to stare, but the inspector was unlike any Illuminari he had seen before. She towered over the others, easily 7 feet tall, with skin that gleamed like polished copper. Instead of the simple tunics worn by the scientists, she wore elaborate robes with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move. Her eyes were not the faceted crystals of the others, but solid gold orbs that reflected light like mirrors. Behind her came an entourage of 4 more Illuminari, carrying various instruments and recording devices. "Hi, Inspector Da," Neri said with a formal bow. "We welcome you to Research Vessel Lumina." Da acknowledged the greeting with a slight nod. Her gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Taiho before returning to Neri. "I understand you have devoted significant resources to a single Earth specimen," she said. Her voice was deeper than the other Illuminari, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Taiho's chest. "The Council requires justification." Neri gestured to a large display screen. "If I may present our findings." What followed was a detailed presentation about Taiho's physical attributes, cognitive abilities, and behavioral patterns. Neri spoke with scientific precision, showing brain scans, cellular analyses, and behavioral test results. Throughout it all, Taiho stood silently beside Yun, feeling increasingly like a zoo animal on display. When Neri finished, Day turned her golden gaze to Jia. "I understand you propose a different research approach." Jia stepped forward eagerly. "Yes, Inspector. While observational data is valuable, we have reached a point of diminishing returns. I propose transferring Specimen X to biological sampling, where we can directly access genetic material for our reproductive regeneration program." She activated her own display, showing diagrams of what appeared to be surgical procedures. Taiho felt sick as he realized what he was seeing: extraction techniques for various organs and tissues. The human reproductive system shares surprising similarities with ancient Illuminari biology, Jia continued. With direct tissue sampling, we could potentially synthesize compatible genetic templates. Day considered this with an impassive expression, and the specimen's viability after these procedures. Jia hesitated for just a moment. Reduced, but sustainable for several extraction cycles. Taiho couldn't stay silent any longer. "I'm standing right here," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Talking about me like I'm not a person with rights." The room went silent. Neri looked alarmed, Jia annoyed, and Ian terrified. But Da turned those golden eyes directly on him with an expression of mild surprise. "It addresses us directly," she noted, "without permission. The specimen has shown unusual linguistic adaptation," Neri explained quickly. "A side effect of our communication tests." Day approached Taiho slowly, towering over him. "Can you understand me, Earth creature?" Taiho straightened his posture, meeting her gaze despite the intimidating height difference. "My name is Taiho. And yes, I understand you perfectly." Dave circled him slowly, like a predator. "Interesting. Yet I see nothing in these reports that indicates exceptional intelligence. Basic language acquisition, pattern recognition, simple problem solving. Many species demonstrate these traits." "With respect, Inspector," Yun said suddenly, stepping forward. "The reports don't capture the human's creative thinking processes." All eyes turned to Yun. Taiho could see her trembling slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I propose a test," she continued. "Our mineral synthesis program has reached an impasse. Let the human attempt a solution." Neri looked surprised but quickly recovered. "An interesting suggestion. The crystalline matrix problem has resisted our best efforts for 3 cycles." Dad considered this a waste of time, likely, but proceed. "I will observe." A workstation was quickly prepared. Taiho was led to a console where complex holographic models appeared, molecular structures that reminded him of the crystal forests in Ian's images of the Illuminari homeworld. "This is our attempt to synthesize living crystal for medical applications," Ian explained, showing him the research data. "The molecular bonds keep failing under biological conditions." Taiho studied the information carefully. The Illuminari approach was elegant in its mathematical precision, each molecule arranged in perfect geometric patterns. But something about it struck him as too rigid, too perfect. "Your approach is very logical," he said, aware that everyone was watching him. "But living things aren't perfectly logical. They adapt, they're messy sometimes." He began manipulating the holographic model, introducing small imperfections into the crystal structure. Where the Illuminari had created perfect symmetry, he added subtle variations. "What are you doing?" Jia asked sharply. "You're destroying the molecular alignment." "No," Taiho said, continuing his work. "I'm making it more like your natural crystal forests. Look at the images of your homeworld. The crystals there aren't perfect. They have variations, little imperfections that allow them to grow and adapt." As he worked, he noticed Jia moving to a secondary console. From the corner of his eye, he saw her making adjustments that changed the parameters of his simulation. increasing temperature beyond the stated requirements, adding molecular stress factors. Instead of pointing out her sabotage, Tahoe simply adjusted his approach. He incorporated the new variables, turning what should have been destructive changes into opportunities for the crystal structure to demonstrate resilience. In nature, stress forces adaptation, he explained as he worked. Humans understand this well. We've survived on a planet with constantly changing conditions. After several minutes of intense concentration, Tahoe stepped back from the console. Try running the synthesis now. Nari initiated the program. The holographic display showed the molecular simulation in real time, bonds forming, structures growing. Where previous attempts had shown crystalline structures that quickly destabilized, Tahoe's model grew steadily, adapting to the challenging conditions Jia had secretly introduced. When the simulation completed, a perfect crystalline structure floated in the display. Not perfect in symmetry, but perfect in function. The reading showed stability under all tested conditions. The room was silent. Even Jia seemed speechless. Day approached the display, studying it with those golden eyes. You introduced deliberate imperfections, she said, not a question but an observation, counter to all established crystalline engineering principles. Perfect things break, Tahoe said simply. Things with small flaws can bend without breaking. A primitive explanation, Dad noted, but there was something new in her tone, a hint of respect, perhaps. Yet the results are unexpected. She turned to face the entire room. I will need time to consider these developments. As she moved to leave, Tahoe spoke again. Inspector Dad, before you go, I have a question. Everyone looked shocked at his boldness, but Day merely turned her head. Speak. What happens to Earth if you decide I'm just a specimen for sampling? Will more humans be collected for your research? Day's golden eyes studied him. That would be the logical next step, yes. Then I hope you'll consider this, Tahoe said. Humans are adaptable, yes. We're biologically interesting, yes. But our greatest strength isn't in our bodies. It's in how we think, how we solve problems, how we create. He gestured to the crystal display. We could help you solve your reproductive crisis, not as specimens, but as partners, as equals. The word equals caused a stir among the Illuminari. Jia looked outraged. Nari seemed troubled. But Ian was watching him with undisguised pride. A bold claim, Day said finally. Perhaps, he conceded, looking at the successful crystal synthesis. There is more to learn from this specimen than I anticipated. As she and her entourage left the chamber, Tahoe caught Ian's eye. A small victory, perhaps, but it was a beginning. You will now be classified as Research Associate Tahoe, Nari announced formally, the first of your kind to hold such status. The laboratory had changed. Instead of a containment cell, Tahoe now had private quarters. The other scientists treated him with cautious respect, though Jia remained coldly distant. Ian had been appointed as Earth liaison. Your world is scheduled for first contact, but not for another century. We could accelerate that timeline with your help. I'd like that, Tahoe said, though I have conditions about how we approach Earth. As they prepared for an exploratory mission back to his homeworld, Tahoe reflected on how far he'd come from being merely Specimen X. In showing the aliens humanity's unique perspective, he'd secured not just his freedom but potentially a better future for Earth and the galactic community. Ian smiled at him as they boarded the ship. Ready to go home, Research Associate Tahoe. 3 days had passed since Inspector Day's decision. 3 days of transformation that still felt unreal to Tahoe. He stood in his new quarters, touching the walls that responded to his presence with soft, adjustable lighting. The bed conformed to his body perfectly when he lay down. The viewing panel showed Earth rotating slowly in the distance, growing larger each day as the research vessel adjusted its orbit. A chime sounded at his door. Enter, Tahoe called, still getting used to having privacy that could be respected. The door slid open, revealing Nari. Her silver hair was arranged formally, her posture as perfect as always, but something about her seemed different. Less rigid, perhaps. "Research Associate Taiho," she said with a small nod. "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "They're amazing," Taiho admitted. "Better than my apartment back home." Neri's crystal eyes studied him curiously. "I've come to provide your official documentation and credentials." She handed him a small device that looked like a pendant on a chain. "This identifies you as a registered sentient being with diplomatic standing in illunary space." Taiho took the pendant, feeling its weight in his palm. "So I'm a person now, not a specimen." "According to High Council directive, yes." Neri hesitated, then added, "I wish to express regret for your initial treatment. Our protocols were designed for non-sentient life forms." Coming from Neri, this was as close to an apology as Taiho could expect. He nodded his acceptance. "There is one more matter," Neri continued. "Inspector Da was impressed by your crystalline solution. She has authorized a limited Earth contact mission. You and Ian will visit your planet to collect preliminary cultural data." Taiho's heart leaped. "I'm going home." "When?" "Preparations are underway now. You depart in 2 cycles." Neri turned to leave, then paused. "Jia will not be joining the mission. I believe this information would relieve you." After she left, Taiho sat on his bed, staring at the pendant. From test subject to diplomat in less than 2 weeks, the universe, it seemed, moved in strange ways. Later that day, Taiho found himself in a new area of the vessel, the Xenobiology Research Center, where the other specimens were housed. Now, with his new status, he had been granted access to observe these beings. What he saw troubled him deeply. Most were contained in environments similar to his former cell. Some paced restlessly, others lay motionless. All were being studied with the same clinical detachment he had experienced. Ian found him there, watching a creature with translucent skin and 4 eyes that tracked his movement curiously. "This one is from the Proxima Centauri system," she explained. "Its species can regenerate limbs within days." "Can it communicate?" Taiho asked. "We believe so, but we haven't found a compatible language structure yet." Taiho turned to face her. "We need to change this." "Change what?" "All of it. The containment, the classification as specimens. If I could prove my sentience, some of these beings can too." Im's skin rippled with colors, her expression thoughtful. "That would require a complete overhaul of research protocols. The High Council would never." "The High Council already made one exception," Taiho pointed out. "Maybe that's how change begins, with one exception at a time." Before Ian could respond, a cold voice interrupted them. "Still trying to upend centuries of scientific procedure, I see." Jia stood in the doorway, her lavender skin almost white under the bright lights. Since Taiho's reclassification, she had avoided him entirely. "Not append," Taiho said carefully. "Improve." Jia moved closer, studying the creatures in their enclosures. "You think yourself their savior now, the human who will teach us advanced beings about ethics." Her voice dripped with disdain. "Not a savior," Taiho replied calmly. "Just someone with a different perspective." "Your perspective nearly cost us a breakthrough in genetic research," Jia said sharply. "My proposal would have yielded tangible results." "At what cost?" Taiho asked. "My life, my dignity. A small price for saving an entire species." In stepped between them. "Jia, the High Council has ruled. Taiho is a research associate now, not a research subject." Jia's crystal eyes narrowed. "Yes, how fortunate for Earth." She turned to leave, then looked back at Taiho. "Enjoy your visit home, human. Remember that your new status is provisional. One mistake, one reason for the Council to question their decision." The threat hung in the air as she departed. "Don't worry about Jia," Yun said after a moment. "She's brilliant but traditional in her thinking." "She's dangerous," Taiho corrected. "And she doesn't seem like someone who accepts defeat easily." The next day, Tai-Ho was summoned to the ship's command center, a circular room with viewing panels that showed the vastness of space in all directions. There, he found Nari and several other Illuminari he hadn't met before, gathered around a large holographic display of Earth.